from the rush of getting here, and I think it's useful for everybody else as well. So it's a and I'm just thinking today that actually the Quaker in me might suggest just a little bit of silence and just taking a few breaths, and just that's what I feel like I need for me, because I've been running around doing things. So let's just take a little quiet minute to just be still and prepare it, let go whatever else we've been doing to get here, and to just be present to this time that we're having with Sean. Something a bit different about holding a silent space on technology than it is when we're actually doing that in a group. But hopefully that's just given us a little way of coming into being present. So thank you so much, Sean, for joining us. I feel like this is a really, it was one of those synchronistic things that we had Aaron Hawkins last week, and you also working for the Dunedin City Council in a policy role, because we got into quite a lot of good discussion about how we actually influence policy. So hearing about your policy role will be really, really interesting. Our kawa is usually that we actually introduce ourselves so that you know a little bit about who we are. We haven't met all that much, but you know that I've been around for a while with a passion for supporting people in their growth of their leadership to be active citizens is really what I do with my life. Yeah. Nicola, would you like to introduce yourself to Sean, and then we'll go around the Zoom room?
So my name is Nicola. I'm in my second year of Leadership for Change degree, and I'm looking at making some videos and documenting some of the cultural processes of Tokelau as a seed bank or a library for people that can't physically be there, or maybe don't have a direct connection there, so that in 100 years times where people might have to migrate away from it, that has been preserved in a way that people can still connect with that island or with those areas. So fantastic. Yeah, that's what I'm looking to work towards over the next 2 years. That's great. Cool.
Thanks, Nicola, for starting us off. So anyone else on Zoom, take it away. Whoever's ready to jump in next. Dean, you're unmuted. Are you ready to go?
Hey, I'm Dean from South Dunedin. I'm using storytelling and local media to build resilient community in South Dunedin.
And with the help of the cat as well.
Apparently.
Cool.
My name's Dan. I'm Christchurch based, and I've only been here a week and a half. So my main focus is looking at providing pathways for contemplative education and looking at trying to change some of the ways we frame reality and the challenges that we face and the questions that we ask and how we might approach them.
Thanks, Dan. Just follow on with whoever else would like to go next.
Kia ora, my name's Briar. I'm also Christchurch based, and I'm a kaipakahaere of a small housing trust. We're looking at co-creating a more grassroots affordable housing model, so working as tenants, and we're sort of 4.5 years into that process. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Juliana. I am based in Raglan, and I'm exploring how different ways people value and connect with the oceans, and trying to work on bridging the knowledge gap between science and society, more or less. Yep.
So there you have an interesting breadth of connections
Excellent.
in the room. Now I know you've prepared some slides. I don't know if you want to use those, but we usually do a kind of interview, so you can do it whichever way you would actually like. If you would like with the laptop to just be taking us through the slides that you have. Usually after the first 15 minutes or so. Oh, Steffi has just joined us too, but I think she's. Do you want to introduce yourself, Steffi? Or just be quietly there in the background? I know that you're not well, so up to you to for us to just acknowledge that you're here, or for you to introduce yourself if you'd like to. I think that might have been Steph. We're just about to share some slides from Sean, so I can't actually see if you've written something in the chat room. Can everybody see those slides all right? Yeah. So yeah, Sean,
Sure.
tell
Excellent.
us, I guess there's at least two parts that I'm really interested in us knowing about your life, as we've talked about, there's sort of this winners don't cheat learnings from the earlier parts of your life, and I think there could well be some conversation about your current role as a Senior Policy Analyst. And
That's right.
Yeah.
So look, thanks very much, Margie Jean, and thanks everyone for those introductions. There's clearly a lot of different bits of work in the room, and a lot of work, I think, that just overlaps a lot with some of the points I just wanted to touch on today. So as Margie Jean mentioned, my name's Sean Jacobs. So I'm actually acting corporate policy manager at Dunedin City Council. And in that role, I think it was in the bio introduction circulated last week. So I look after a sort of whole of council planning, corporate planning tools. So the annual plan, the annual report, the 10-year plan, which is obviously a 10-year plan for the city that will come out next year. And then also looking after our climate action planning for the city, and in particular our city's goal to become a net carbon zero city by 2030, which is no small feat. But yeah, what I've done is just actually, I know we kick off with a discussion typically, I've just put together some slides to just briefly step through that I think probably just talks a bit to more some of the key lessons that I've in my book, and I'll touch on that in a second, but it might just be more of the capabilities that underpin my career in policy so far.
That's really useful.
And then we can obviously get into that discussion of specific policy points. But yeah, don't be daunted by the slides. I won't spend too much time on them. But yeah, so as was mentioned, and the title of this presentation is Winners Don't Cheat. So in 2018, I was very fortunate to publish my first book, first and only book for now, which has the unfortunate subtitle of Advice for Young Australians from a Young Australian. But it's not too provincial because there's a lot of key lessons in there that can apply that are very universal. So, while I've had, I guess I'm in a decent role now at Dunedin City Council as the acting corporate policy manager, leading a team of around 10 and looking after some pretty significant products. From a policy perspective, I had a really slow start out of high school. So I failed to get into university took me about 13 goes over a couple of years to get out of school and into university. But I was able to turn that slow start around and did a bridging course, got myself into a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations in Brisbane at Griffith University, which is where I'm from. And then I worked for the Australian Aid Program, and then I spent a few years in Canberra working for the National Security Advisor, and then also briefing the Prime Minister on disaster recovery issues, and obviously national security policy in Australia. And then I worked for the Queensland Minister for Education as a Senior Policy Advisor, and then for the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, which is Australia's largest local government and one of the largest local governments in the world. I was a Senior Policy Analyst or Senior Policy Advisor, and looking after climate change and sustainability issues for the Lord Mayor of Brisbane. And then I saw this opportunity here, and then with my fiance decided about December 2018 to come over to Dunedin, do something a little bit different for a while, and then I guess grow and put my policy skills to the test, and that's certainly been the case. But one of the key things is just that it took me a lot of time to actually get to building these capabilities. And I think that key thing for me was coming out of high school, and I did find myself in a place, I think a lot of young people, but just anyone in a key transition point in their life can find themselves today. And that, you know, I didn't quite have the skills and experience compared to where I wanted to actually go. I was thinking a lot about my rights at the time and not so much about my responsibilities or building capabilities and that sort of thing. And I think everyone sort of has an inkling of this, but I knew I had a bit more in me, or a sense of untapped character that I just knew needed to be tested and refined and teased out a bit more. But I knew that I hadn't quite realised that yet. And I think, you know, if everyone can see the slides, obviously, I've just put some points down there about some of the things that I think are being teased out at a societal-wide level today. And I think I was certainly kind of on that path. And while it's not a rags to riches story, it's certainly in that same character of building capabilities and getting to where you want to go and managing these sorts of obstacles here. So I just want to very briefly touch on some of the key points in my book. And so Winners Don't Cheat, importantly, it's not a list book. It's not full of, you know, commandments or things that you should do. I think I mentioned should. It's a 100-page book. I mentioned the word should about 12 times, and none of those are in the context of you should do this, you should do that. So it's really just working through or distilling down concepts like I've got on the screen, but becoming a better writer, you know, properly goal setting, building your skills, character building, all those sorts of really important things that I learned on my lesson over the past sort of 12 years in professional life. So I'll just get straight into it. I'll step through again pretty briefly some of these things. One of the key things that helped me out was role models and being able to look down the road for someone to sort of act like a blueprint and help you get to where you want to go. And I've got Chris Rock up on the screen there, and because I do actually quote him in the book, because there's a wonderful quote where he says that everybody needs to see a version of themselves do something. It's just good. It makes you feel like you can do it. And that's a really good point. But the key point I also make in the book is that you need to look at role models from a variety of areas. So it's great to find role models that look like you in your field, because that can really help you with a blueprint to where you want to go. Someone I admire greatly, someone on the bottom right of the screen there, is Neville Bonner. So he was Australia's first federal Indigenous parliamentarian. But, you know, I do feel that a lot of young people today can actually self-disqualify themselves. They see someone who doesn't look like them in a certain field, and then think that's not for us, that we can't do that, which is obviously not the best way to go. So I thought, you know, what was a really important thing for me was getting a variety of role models from different areas. So I'm up on the screen, I've just got some examples. So someone like Sam Harris, the neuroscientist, some of his logic and thinking and writing really inspired me. There's a guy, Patrick Lee Fermor, who died a few years ago, is a great travel writer and war hero in the Battle of Crete, but a fantastic writer. Certainly not my kind of writer, but someone I admired for their capacity to write. I've got Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister in this one too, just for his lessons of political perseverance that quite stand out, regardless of what side of politics you're on, I think. And then in the bottom right, there's Paul Keating. So he's a complete on the opposite side of politics to John Howard, but someone who was responsible for some of the biggest economic reforms in Australian history, but who left school at 15 and completely taught himself absolutely everything when it came to macroeconomics, and who's seen as someone who's a great standout leader. So the key point is just being able to draw role models from a variety of sectors and tease out some of the generic characteristics of those people rather than following one person exactly to a T. So the general lessons, I did look at these, you know, people I looked up to at the time, and especially those who've mapped out a career in public policy or international affairs. And, you know, one thing I noticed that they never took their time for granted in their early 20s. So this was a big wake-up call for me, is just make every post a winner that you can. I think everyone, you know, here today is on a good trajectory because you've enrolled in something, you're taking steps to do something positive, and you know where you want to contribute. But that's actually quite unusual, I think, for a lot of people to do. But yeah, these were the key characteristics that I found with some of the people that I looked at in my field. And I think they can apply for any field that a person may find themselves in today. I've got aptitude up here, so I guess getting serious about what your strengths are. And I think probably a key point here is that, you know, I was never good with numbers. So I was obviously going to find it hard to be an engineer. I was terrible at science. So, you know, being a scientist or, you know, someone into medicine, while it would be a nice idea in theory, it's just not my thing. And, you know, people have different strengths and different aptitudes. And I think lining yourself up with your aptitudes is a key thing. I don't think you're ever supposed to know exactly what you want to do, but some of the key questions that I've got up there, you know, if you can at least, you know, if you don't have to know all the answers to those things, but having some indication or thinking about those questions early can certainly help out and orient you towards your, just in the interest of time, so that's Professor David Stowe. So he's an Australian professor. He has a wonderful quote, but I might share that with you offline, that so we can just keep stepping through things. And just in, I do cite these figures in the book, they might be a bit dated, but this is just in the field of aptitude. So actually calculating the odds of success in your chosen field. So I do find that a lot of people tend to think about,
I'm locking the office. I'm locking the office. Do you need a key? I do. I'll grab it. Thank you.
Excellent. So this one is just about, again, calculating the odds of success in your chosen field. I think a lot of people think about, and this is an American-based example, obviously, but think about the glamorous professions or what's the, you know, in terms of the limelight and spotlight or making a huge amount of money, all those sorts of things. They tend to be bright and shiny and attract us, value add. But if you look at the right column and you think about where you can actually more realistically apply effort, this doesn't mean that you don't aim high or have aspirations, but a lot of people forget that you can have an incredibly rewarding, a very decent career in professions such as, you know, I've got there on the right hand column, but in an area where you can actually be able to carve out some serious space, and where there's lots more opportunity to actually do that. So I just find that those figures are always a key reminder, even though they're not fully current. I think they might be over 10 years old, but I think the example is quite instructive. Lifelong learning. This is something that I think, you know, regardless of how many degrees you get or if you finish formal study, it's just quite important to keep in mind. Apparently, the average person reads 4 books a year, but I do think that's quite optimistic. A lot of people I know, a lot of close friends wouldn't get close to that. So I think it's still a quite high estimate, but I do cite in the book as well when former American President George Bush had reading battles with his top advisor, Karl Rove, and they would cover between 40 and 64 books each per year. And I thought, again, the key lesson there is that regardless of how busy you are being an American president or working in the White House, that you're still able to find time to read. And, you know, those were quite difficult books as well when you go through the list. So I do think that, again, regardless of where everyone, I think, finds themselves in whatever profession, they can still actually find time to read, because it is a fantastic way to just contribute to that, or that lesson, or that philosophy of lifelong learning, pardon me. And this is probably getting a bit dated now, but you know, the Khan Academy, a lot of the leading institutions have a lot of their courses online that you can certainly, you know, benefit from and, you know, study in your own time if you're so inclined. But it's back to that principle of lifelong learning that's just so important. Now, this is quite interesting. It seems like it's a bit flippant, the title, but this is from the Harvard Business School Professor of Innovation, Clayton Christensen. And one of the key questions that he asked his classes at Harvard is, how can you be sure that you'll stay out of prison? And, you know, everyone sort of laughs and there's a bit of jeering, but you notice that actually 2 out of the 32 Rhodes Scholars in his year actually ended up in jail. And you think, well, that's kind of pretty amazing when you think about some of the people that would have been, you know, in that fraternity with him at that time as a Rhodes Scholar. But it's just an important principle to keep in mind. And I'm not sure if I actually mentioned these specific examples in the book, but I've just put the top line of the slides there of people who have been world beaters in their fields and been hugely successful, but have been known quite publicly in the last few years to have made some pretty questionable decisions in their private life. And on the bottom there, I've got someone who's getting quite old now, but is a professor of economics in the United States, Professor Thomas Sowell. And he's just a great example that I've found, and I'll just cite 2 quick examples from his career. where one, he was a young, so he's based in Chicago as an economist, and he was a young African-American man looking for a job, and he went for a job at the National Security Agency as a photographer. And then when he actually rocked up to the job, he found that the position wasn't there because they had worked out his complexion and it had mysteriously disappeared. So he wrote to his congressman, the issue got rectified. He got offered the job a few weeks later. And then when it actually came down to it, he'd just been offered it based on that. And he says, no, thanks, that I don't want it that way. So it's a really good example of just staying principled, even then when you've got a lot of professional advantage. The other end of that is he's 4 decades into his career, very distinguished economist, very well known. He's offered a spot on the American Journal of Economic Review, so the premier economics journal in the world. He's offered a spot, and after finding out that it's for attempts to racially diversify the board, says the exact same thing as he did 4 decades previously. No thanks, I don't want it that way. And I think, those two examples, and I guess you can unpack the specifics of those, I've always just found as just probably good examples of almost to the point of being stubborn, but staying principled on key things. And just how difficult it is, I sense, when you're staring professional advantage in the face and lots of opportunity. This is just the last slide, and I've just put up some here, what I think is a key solve, and I do open the book with this chapter about hard work and just the importance of time spent in whatever endeavour you want to pursue. So Mark Spitz is up there in the top left, who was the Michael Phelps of his day, and he apparently swam enough laps to swim around the equator in all of his training. Daley Thompson, bottom left, is the decathlon champion, the great decathlon champion, who said that he trained on Christmas Day twice because he knew his opponents weren't. Tiger Woods, of course, despite his indiscretions and making bad decisions, still has quite impressive and almost to the point of maniacal training regime where just 5 hours a day on top of his already hectic training schedule, he just hits golf balls for a period of 5 hours. And I've got Mozart up there because in a great book that I cite a few times in mine, he's a great illustration of this example of hard work. And over time, even though we think he's a prodigy and it all just came to him. So I'll just quote this from Mark Colvin's book, or Jeff Colvin, pardon me, Talent is Overrated. And I'll just quote, surviving manuscripts show that Mozart was constantly revising, reworking, crossing out and rewriting whole sections, jotting down fragments and putting them aside for months or years. And the key lesson is that he wrote music the way ordinary humans do. It's a really humanising element to a lot of people that we see, again, a lot of things, like we look at in history and look at, world-beating success and don't really think about all of the graft and all the key hard work that's actually gone into that and the time spent over a long period of time and really considered effort as well. So I do think that's one of the key pillars in whatever endeavour it is that you're doing. That I think a lot of people can take away from is just that necessity of just hard work over time. So just sort of rounded out some of the key points I've just touched on there. And again, that's more about the capabilities, and I'm very happy to talk policy or any of those things with anyone, of course, as well. But I just thought it'd be a good scene setter for.
It provides some context, and it's an interesting example. So I might just stop sharing those for a minute now. But thank you very much for sharing those. One of the and welcome Shakir. I could hear that somebody else had joined, but I couldn't see with the screen being shared. So one of the things everybody has to do on this program, is increasingly be able to articulate their own professional framework of practice, in the sense of who am I and what sort of underpins us. So what you've shared with us in a way is a bit of an insight into some elements of your professional framework of practice, really.
Yes.
I think it's a nice example of how we start to articulate what's at the core of what we bring to any particular life situation and or job. So it's more than just a professional framework of practice is more than just our CV, if you like, in terms of what we can do. So, so I'm going to throw it open to the floor now, because I know that some of you will want to unpack some of those things that Sean's just introduced to us now, and others of you might want to come more into his current role. and the whole policy area that's brought you here to this conversation in terms of building on what we did last week about influencing policy and how you work out a plan to achieve a carbon zero Dunedin. So the floor is open for anybody's questions, and if there's silence from the floor, well, I will chip in, but I think it's much better for this to be your space. So go, Briar, you look like you're ready to roll, so go for it.
Yeah, I actually took a note from, there was a snippet of something you'd written online, and there was a quote by Colin Powell in it, and it's, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. And I've actually put a ring around that because it's so relevant to my my current life, work life. And I guess what I'd like you to unpack is some context for me. I'm in a position where I guess professionally, I'd say we're continuously learning from extreme challenges. Privately, sometimes it's things like I failed and I just want to spend the rest of my life with my head under a pillow, and this feels awful and I'm so sorry. And if you could just offer anything about that trajectory of coming back from what feels like failure is actually learning, but still can feel, be hard to kind of navigate out of.
Yeah, sure.
Fantastic question, Briar.
Yeah. Now I'm glad you picked up on. Sorry, go ahead.
And just welcome, Andreas. Yeah, we're just at question time, Andreas. So feel free to join us in that. So
sure.
Over to you, Sean.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon.
Excellent. No, thanks, Brian. Good pickup. I mean, I'd forgotten I'd put that on the slide, but it's such an important thing. I think one of the key things is just, if you, I talk a bit about in the book about deliberate practice, and one of the key components of that is actually getting a feedback loop going. So there's a lot written about the term deliberate practice. Some of you may have come across it or even just searched it online. And part of a key component of that is being able to give, like I mentioned, give yourself a feedback loop about what it is that you've done. What are you feeling, that you feel like you failed immensely at? Looking at where you can specifically improve on that, and working out where. And the key thing about that is distilling, I suppose, things that you have personal control over versus something that's a strategic shortcoming. Because I think when you distill things down, there's a lot of things that I guess are beyond, yourself, and decisions that are out of your hands, and not thinking too hard about those, but thinking really hard about the personal things that you're responsible for as part of that picture. This is a really minor example, but one of the key things, I do touch on this in the book, is that, and I still just remember it because it's forced me to actually get better, is I remember just when I worked for the United Nations in Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, I was responsible for putting together a multi-regional workshop with a lot of practitioners from all over the Pacific. And I just knew that, I was supposed to do it, I was getting around to it, and then it just kept approaching and approaching and approaching, and I put it off entirely. And then when my regional manager checked in with me, this is probably about a fortnight out, she realised that I'd done about 10% of what I was supposed to actually do. And that was just a horrible lesson in just being, thinking back to that, is being, do I want to be in that situation ever again? There's been lots of examples like that, but that's probably one I want to share with publicly. But you really have to think about this, do you want to be in that situation again? And, the key answer is no. So that what you want to do is actually think with the end in mind about what kind of outcome you want to get, what can you actually control, and even just make a simple list of things that you can start doing so you can mitigate any sort of future failure or disaster, and then that you can actually start working on. And I've saved my skin so many times because I've been able to think about that, with the end in mind, what's in control, what isn't, and actually working through that. And then I guess that comes from that thing about, Briar, about learning from failure, and just actually learning from it.
Can I just feed back, because this is really important to me and I want to make sure I've heard you properly? You talked about deliberate practice.
Yep.
And then creating a feedback loop with myself, and I suppose I could extrapolate that and say my team, distilling the main points of learning, and then just focusing relentlessly on our own responsibility and what we have control of, and then setting an outcome going, well, if we don't want that to happen again, we want something else to happen, and then what are the ingredients that need to be different?
Spot on, that's exactly right. And the only other thing I would add to that, and I don't want to cite too many things or concepts, is this idea of a growth mindset. And I'm sure you've come across a lot of you would have come across it before, but it's really being able to see challenges as opportunities to grow. And that's such a hard mindset to get into, because I still struggle with it every single day. But it's really just seeing, again, challenges as a chance to learn and adopt that deliberate practice approach, but then see it as a chance to actually grow and get to where you want to go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Cool.
It also, what you're saying also reminds me of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If any of you have come across that, I'm more likely to pull out old literature than new literature for you, but there's some really good material in there. We can talk about that a little bit more in the debrief, but your comments about working within your sphere of influence in terms of what you can control, and his theory is, we've got our circle of concern is this big, but our circle of influence is more like this big. And if we focus in on our circle of influence will actually grow. But if we're all over the place out here in our circle of concern, like my dear mother who lived till nearly 99, who would stay awake in the middle of the night worrying about what was happening on the other side of the world because she had such a big heart. Her circle of concern was so huge. But I'd have to say to her, sometimes, but Mum, I love that you're a big heart, but you actually staying awake in the middle of the night isn't actually going to be making any influence or impact over that. So I think that's really wise advice that you're talking about in terms of figuring out what we have control over and what part we can actually play.
Sure.
So open to those of you who've just joined more recently. Sean's shared a bit of a slideshow around some of his life lessons around leadership, and he's also in a city council role that's influencing the planning for the city at all sorts of levels, including around climate change. So if you're interested in that aspect or other things that you've heard for now, just feel free to ask more questions and build this into a conversation.
I have a question about the after your high school. You said that you tried to get into university 13 times. What continued that motivation to get there and to achieve that over that period? And was there what were the ups and downs, and how did you get through that?
Yeah, sure. No, that's a good question, Nicola. Thank you. I think one of the key things was probably that untapped character thing, about knowing that you've got something more to contribute. You've got a decent concept about what you want to do, but ideas about where you want to go, where you kind of see yourself. And then I guess one of the key things that I was told all the time was that if you want to get into university, or if you want to study something, you can absolutely do it. It just takes a bit of time. You might not take the most direct route there. And so I think it was probably just a combination of things. So it was that, again, sort of feeling like I had something to contribute, knowing a little bit about where I wanted to go, and then having a pathway or some sort of pathway to start to clear up to how to get there. So I did a bridging course, as I touched on, and it's probably, I studied a diploma in liberal arts, so it's probably not studied too much anymore, but and it wasn't what I wanted to study at all, but I knew that I had to do this for a year to show to the university that I could actually, work on, improving my school grades, and again, complete that sort of bridging side of things. So it was those sort of combination of those three things that I think was quite helpful. Have great ideas, but then have some sort of within, a pathway within your grasp to actually get you into where you want to go. And it's certainly, it probably less motivates me now, but I do like that sort of concept of, looking, and another Stephen Covey's is thinking with the end in mind, so it can apply to role models as well. And you think, well, who's that, woman or man or whoever in that position that I'd aspire to be like? What characteristics do they have that I want as well? So there's a combination of those things. And at that particular point in my life, I found those things, really motivated me to keep the flame alive, I suppose. Yeah. Thank you.
There's a follow-up question that comes to my mind is how do you get from there to being a senior policy analyst?
Sure,
I mean, what are some of the capabilities that a person working in policy actually needs to grow? Because
sure,
that's not something that fits into a neat and tidy little qualification. So we're really interested in a lot of these people in this room could have probably got the capabilities to grow into policy people if that's where your heart grows as well.
Yes, I think probably one of the key things, it's a great question as well, is I devote a chapter on becoming a better writer, and I think writing well is something that is just needed by anyone, whether you're crafting an email, or even if you're writing a book, for example. You obviously need to be quite a decent writer, but what that actually means is that you're able to distill down information, you're able to summarize things, and articulate things and ideas in a succinct way, and you're able to think, I think probably strategically about certain problems and issues. I just scribbled down a couple of key things because one of the things that I learned, I was very fortunate, like I mentioned, to work in Canberra when I worked for the National Security Advisor and the Prime Minister, was how you actually brief someone like the Prime Minister on a really important policy topic. So there's huge amounts of information that can come in that you need to try and distill down. And the briefs that we used to write had to go onto one page, so there was no raw room. A very exceptional circumstance, you'd go to 1.5 pages and purge a lot of stuff into the background. But that really forces you to write succinctly and distill key things down. And one of the key things, and I guess it goes back to your point, Briar, is just learning really quickly and being able to pick up on key things that you're taught. I used to write policy briefs and they'd come back, that might work well or I thought were pretty decent, and come back with so much red ink on them that, it would have to be turned over, or they'd take it upon themselves to actually tighten it up themselves. And, it's horrifying, when you're starting out your career, you're getting all this feedback. It's hugely overwhelming. And you think, all the sorts of things that you're talking about before, Briar, about not sort of being capable about doing the job and doing it well. But the key thing is that I was able to actually properly, in my case, get over my own ignorance and actually learn, and really just think about, okay, I've been given advice from someone who knows how to do this job, and they've literally mapped out for me how you would write something better. And so, again, it's probably a bit of getting over where you think your capabilities are and a bit of your ego, but then just looking at it and thinking about that and referring back to that whenever you've got to put something together. One of the key things too, and again, is, thinking with the end in mind. So I always study to become a better writer, looking, for example, at policy briefs that have been written, policy documents that have been available online, even emails from senior managers or CEOs, that put out to their companies about how you would write something to a broader audience. And I think you can just draw so much from those styles or those examples of writing, that when you look to doing something like that yourself, you can at least replicate it. So you're not just starting from scratch. So I do think it just really comes down, Margie, to being a good writer, I suppose, and all that entails about thinking strategically, distilling down key things. And then I think always in policy, whatever level of government you're in, you're always putting things towards a decision maker to make a decision. And that's probably one of the key things that I've sort of learnt over my sort of 12 years in working various governments, is that being able to explain it something and distill it down to a decision maker where they're equipped to make a decision based on the advice that you're able to give them. And doing that in a really clear and concise way is a key skill, I think, that prepare you well for a career in policy.
Yeah, it's interesting because it highlights, as you're talking for me, how much writing isn't just a writing process, it's a thinking process as well.
For sure.
So there's a huge lot of thinking going into the synthesizing of all that data. So sometimes, you know, we know how hard it is to write a one-pager. We might have written 10 pages before we could actually distill it down into an executive summary of a one-pager.
Sure.
To really, so I think when we struggle sometimes to write the succinct one-pager, don't think that people always start there. There's sometimes quite a long process of getting your thoughts out on paper before you can actually just spit them out, just like sometimes speaking them out to other people really help.
Right.
I also love what you're saying about the decision-making focus. You've got the end use of what you're writing and the end user very, very clearly in mind as you're doing that thought process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And probably just another point to come in behind there as well is that, you know, don't feel like if there's this great term about what you leave on the cutting room floor. And it's a sort of something I heard recently that it just reminded me a lot about, you know, don't feel like you're, if you've done, say, a huge amount of research for something and you don't use it all in what you're actually doing at that point in time, don't be too defeated by that, because there's certainly things that you can use in different times. It would have informed your thinking, and you know, often what you leave on the cutting room floor is sometimes more important than what you actually put up for advice, or what you apply in an assignment, or what you do in the career or the sector that you're working in. So yeah, don't feel bad about doing that. It's actually probably a really good sign that you've got a lot of stuff left over that you've worked hard on.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
Somebody else out there sitting on a question you want to ask Sean? Go, Dean.
Hey, Sean, I guess the council sort of looks a bit managerial in most of its function to the outsider. Where do the ideas come from? Who sparks the beginnings of policy that you guys have to develop and implement? Who are the entrepreneurs in that process?
Yeah, thanks, Dean. It's a really good question. I was actually just thinking about that on my way here, and you know, one of the things that I do think that I didn't quite understand until I'd worked in government for a while was, you know, how very rarely you're actually starting from scratch. So you're right, you are in a constrained environment to a degree, because as a policy advisor, for example, you've got you know, an existing decision from council or from parliament. You've got an existing budget that's, you know, in year 2 of year 4 that you've committed funds to. You've got legislative parameters that you've got to sit inside. You've got issues of the day that might pop up in the ODT where, you know, something you put on the back burners all of a sudden high on the priority list from a policy perspective, and having to manage all those competing priorities, but work within those sorts of parameters. You know, at the same time though, what I was, you know, people look at the public sector and don't really think about innovation. We sort of look to, I guess, a lot of private sector, you know, the commercial sector and industry for those sorts of examples. But I think even in, you know, the creativity about what you're doing and meeting certain, like I could cite like lots of different things. So for example, you know, one of the problems, say, for this is not a great example, and it's probably quite boring, but you know, we, for example, with the annual plan that we're about to put out at the moment, had a couple of issues about having an amendment to our 10-year plan. Again, this says terribly boring and not exciting stuff, but it was a proposed rating change that right up until our consultation period opens up tomorrow. So until last week, we didn't have a clear advice from the auditor or legal advice on what we actually needed to include in the consultation period or document. So we're about to go out. You know, you've got council that's already made a decision, an expectation from senior managers, you know, the people even in our comms and our strategic comms team ready to hit print on a consultation document. Huge array of different, you know, legal on the phone as well, Audit New Zealand, our chief financial officer, lots of different interests and people, a lot of uncertainty. And then, you know, you need to really think creatively about how you get out of these situations and get a practical outcome that satisfies, you know, the mayor plus our legislative obligations, full council, the full executive leadership team. Again, it's not an exciting example, but there's a lot of thinking in that around being, experienced and thinking creatively about how you confront challenges. And again, I don't want to underline this too much. It's not a great example, but it's back to this thing about thinking about what your sphere of influence is and what you're doing in that, and being able to think creatively to come up with a response to a challenge that you've got. So it might not answer your question in full, but there's a lot of professional satisfaction that you can draw from meeting certain operational or policy challenges, from being in the room or confronting a challenge that no one else will see, but that you can actually derive a lot from. So, yeah.
I'm just thinking about a follow-up, Dean, and you tell me if there's a follow-up that you've got instead, but I'm just thinking about South Dunedin, where you live, and your question about where do ideas come from and how much that South Dunedin community is trying to engage with the council around climate change responses. So is that part of where you're coming from in terms of, where's yes, the private sector does a lot of innovation, but the community also often has innovative ideas. So that was an area that we were exploring a little bit last week with Aaron as well, and encouraging us that we can have voice. It would be interesting to know from a policy perspective in your role, how can that voice, what are you doing from your end to try and make sure that those listening ears are on to the community's ideas about how we respond to climate change, for example, whether it's South Dunedin or anywhere else.
Maybe just to come in behind that, and this might focus my response a bit better for you, Dean, but what I've seen here in Dunedin and working for local government is really quite unique to anywhere else I've worked in a policy sense, and exactly what you're saying, Margie Jean, about literally designing solutions that are led by the community and having a proper consultation process. A lot of governments approach things with, I guess, a pre-designed policy position, or again, it's related to some of those legislative concerns or previous decisions that have been made, and you tend to come to a problem with a lot of the top-down solution. But whereas, concepts or programs like South Dunedin Futures are really looking at a community-led response from a climate change adaptation point of view. But it's so different to what you're used to in government. And I think what a lot of people have sort of been conditioned to expect with government is going, what is this, what's the actual plan? What are we doing in this space over the next 4 years, 8 years, 10, 30 years, and that kind of thing, versus, this idea of, will you tell us where the priorities are, or will you tell us what you think the solutions are, and we design things around that. That's something that's not, governments really are not set up hugely well to do those sorts of things, or engage in that kind of way, or have those sort of very, very community-led solutions. Well, they are, but in very, focused or narrow ways, versus some of the big, a big thing like in South Dunedin.
That's really good to hear, actually. That it did answer my question, and I found it very encouraging. I lived in the Kuiper district when the entire council was removed and replaced by commissioners without any consultation, and we never noticed the difference. So and I definitely could say we would notice the difference in Dunedin. I've seen just far more interaction with the council at every level. So, and hearing that from you makes me feel like I'm not just seeing that really is what you guys believe as well. It's quite encouraging.
Cool. Thanks, Dean.
And I just really want to affirm your question too, Dean, because I think having been part of some of that, the other part of my life is working with an organisation called Inspiring Communities, which is explicitly encouraging community-led approaches. And so I think that often there is a clash between the community-led and managerialism, because we've had so much pressure around managerialism as the dominant mode of being, especially since the 1990s. So I think that tension that you've named and started to unpack between the two of you is a really important one for us to. It is the space within which we work often, as people who can see social innovations wanting to happen, and we do sometimes come up against managerial brick walls, trying to get heard. So
for sure.
Anyone else got other questions or places you want to take this conversation with Sean? We've got a few more minutes, and Shaked, you didn't have a chance to actually introduce yourself, so feel free to do that as well if you want to include that with a question. Or Andreas. Oh, Briar, go if no one else wants to.
I guess, I mean, does anyone else? Like, I'm really happy to sit
No,
down.
go for it. It's first come, first served. Other people can wave their hands at me and say that they've got a question to ask. So,
I guess I'm just, from your experience, is there, I'm really interested in the process of developing policy and how policy becomes action. And what is there like a standardized successful formula for the process of turning policy into action, especially I guess again the context is we're a very values-driven organization, so that's what I'm interested in.
Great questions.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks again, Bryce. So I think probably the key thing that stands out when we talk about policy and government is just I suppose thinking about the politics too. You know, if you're too focused on the policy, you've got to have a lot of political support if you want to talk about you know, action, or when policy actually becomes action, is just making sure you've got a lot of top cover for what you want to do. And that's just such a critical component, because I've seen this a lot of times where, you know, especially when I worked in politics, where I guess you've got, you know, from a policy sense, people wanting to do, you know, key things, and it's not linking up at the political end, which I think, you know, really absolutely needs to happen if you're going to have, you know, we talk about, Brian, when policy actually becomes action. But I think some of the remedies for that, you know, you know, looking at the generic characteristics, I suppose, of what it is you're trying to achieve from a policy sense. You know, like, are you thinking about, do you want to enhance, you know, for example, you know, what are the principles about what you're trying to achieve? You know, do you want more choice for your customers, or for, you know, people, for clients, for example? Or do you want to, you know, reduce costs? Is that the overriding objective? You know, when I look, for example, at our net carbon zero city goal, it's actually really establishing some of these fundamentals. So, like, what are we thinking? You know, we talk about net carbon zero, but, you know, what do we do when we talk about methane as a city? Is that the national goal? Is it our goal? So there's all these sorts of fundamentals that need to be lined up or worked on. And I think as well is trying to leverage something that's probably existing or in play already. Very fortunate to have, I mentioned at the start, the next 10-year plan for Dunedin coming up next year. And that more or less lines up, the next 10 years lines up with our goal to become a net carbon zero city by 2030. So you can imagine from a policy perspective, the whole organisation, you know, 900 plus people, full council, a lot of external stakeholders, and, you know, the city is just very keen to work out where they can fit in, how people can actually contribute to this goal, this overarching goal to become a net carbon zero city. So automatically there, you've got a strategic objective that you can start lining things up about going, okay, well, you want to do this from a policy perspective, and here's how you make it actionable, and there's the end goal about how you do it. If we didn't have that overarching strategic objective, i.e. we didn't think about the politics and have the political support and the strategy there, it'd be really difficult for us to actually make, you know, coherent policy and actually turning that into action. But because we've got a good view of the strategic landscape, plus our key principles, it just makes it so much easier to work out where we want to go.
Can you give us an example of what you think, I mean, of a particular policy around the climate change area that the council's worked on? Because I'm just wondering for some people whether this whole idea of what on earth policy is could be brought alive with a, I mean, I'm not assuming that whether people know or don't know about policy, but it would bring alive this also almost unpacking this mystique around what's this thing called policy.
Sure.
What kind of things would go into a policy compared to an action plan?
Yes, fair enough. So, yeah, so probably just a key thing around that, and I haven't come up with some really glamorous examples, but I'll cite them anyway. So, for example, sorry, Margaret.
Yeah, or just one. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, sure.
Or
So, I mean, one, for example, is that we're just looking at updating DCC's procurement policy at the moment. So this is really, again, unglamorous, but you think about all of the contracting that council does and all the business that we, the gateway that we have and the contracts that we have for, roading and footpaths, maintenance, all the facilities that we have, all of council operations, when it comes to fleet. I guess the influence we have over the planning scheme and the roading network and all these sorts of things, and our interactions with regional council and putting people on buses, building bikeways. You actually start to work that out, and we've got a huge amount of capacity to influence. And one of those things is actually through the procurement policy. So we're getting millions of dollars worth of contracting for all those things that I've just mentioned, and actually having, a key part of our policy, and beefing up sustainability credentials as part of that, and what we actually require from providers or consultants or any contractor who does huge amounts of work that has a huge carbon impact on the city, and being able to actually put in contracts certain things in the procurement policy that demands that certain providers or contractors think more sustainably, are able to prove their sustainability credentials, show, I guess, on paper where they're actually looking at decarbonising things or their certain initiatives, or even where they're actually increasing the city's capacity to adapt to climate change. So quite a boring policy instrument, but hugely important when it comes to I guess setting yourself up and being able to influence certain things on the city. And again, it's probably a good minor example of an interaction with policy. And
that's a great example, because it's basically saying, this policy is, we're setting the rules of the game.
Yes.
If you want us to pay you as a contractor or a supplier for council, we're expecting you to be accountable around your commitment to this carbon zero strategy that we've got over here.
Sure.
So really good way to bring it alive in terms of So just one other question that flows from that: what makes for a good? Because I'm thinking some of us won't be connected at that high level with local government, but even in organisations that we're running, or even little projects that we're running, we've almost got implicit policies about what's the rules of the game that we're saying is good or bad. So I'm just thinking, for any time we're writing a policy, what are some of the ingredients of what makes a good policy?
Sure. I think one of the key things is actually making sure you're talking to people, and making sure you I guess appropriately consult with the right people, and give people an opportunity to I guess have feedback or weigh in. Probably goes back to as well those key sort of principles about what you're trying to achieve, and where do you actually, what's the actual problem? And what are you trying to achieve? It might often be, sometimes the case that not doing anything about something might be or leaving the current policy in place might be a better outcome potentially, and revisiting the policy again in a few years' time, or when more information comes to light. And that's, not a classic bureaucratic thing of doing, but it might genuinely be the case. It's worth looking at something down the track and not right now. But I think that's the key thing, is just that consultation, making sure you've got the appropriate people, to talk to, and then also just confirming your fundamentals as well, and being able to, it's really just, I think, almost like, running a decent project and having decent principles around project management, is just being able to constantly revisit, the scope of what you're doing, and ensuring that, when you do change tack, that it's within, I guess, the key principles of what you're trying to do, and I guess the timeframes of when you're trying to deliver. But I'd say the key thing is just making sure you're getting a really good picture of the problem, what you're trying to solve, and you're talking to the right people about what you need to do to get to solve that problem.
Yeah, I really like that sense of the consultation over the policy is almost as important as the content of it, and it comes back to your point about the politics.
Yes.
Really, you might have worked with managing the politics in a government sense, but even in an organisation like Briar's, you know, when you're developing policy, it's about, is everybody on board with this, as opposed to somebody. I had an interesting experience in Papua New Guinea many years ago, when for about 10 years we were working in many Pacific countries, and somebody in an NGO leadership program was basically saying, "Oh, you bring in the lawyers to write the policy for us because we don't have the skills to write the policy." And I just about screamed and said, "No, but policy is an expression of how we do things around here, and it's got to come from your culture and your values as an organisation. That's really what policy is doing, is expressing those things."
Sure. Yeah. A good point.
Hey, we're just about up for Sean's time. So has anybody else got another question that you would like to ask, or a comment that you would like to make as we just draw this to a close? Shakid?
Yeah.
And then Dean.
Something, maybe it's a little bit repeating, but maybe Sean, you'll be able to kind of throw some light towards that. So I think somewhat similar to what Briar kind of type of organization I was working with, developing an eco village, and there's that dynamic that we were just talking about kind of around how policy needs to come from the public or from the people who are going to be influenced by it, because it's an expression of what's important to them. So it's their needs, and the policy is about serving their needs. But then those people are not necessarily focused enough on those specific things to identify that there's a need for a policy and what it should be. And so sometimes, as being part of, at the time of the trust board, I was able to identify things earlier than most people and start writing and start kind of developing policy. And it seemed like there's so much care needs to be invested in those early stages in order not to go too far, that the policy feels too complete for people to be engaged with it in a meaningful way, but then going far enough so people can engage with it at all.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm not sure kind of what kind of strategies and ideas you or council are using for that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Shakir. I think you've even, I've got probably nothing more to add than what you've identified, is probably just being, that sort of halfway place between having something that's fully mature and developed, and something that's just, not, undercooked, but by actually designing something that doesn't actually need to be designed, and just leaving, I guess, the policy in a state where it's not ready to actually solve a problem or it's not actually needed at the moment. I think one of the things too that you touched on is just, it's almost like death by consultation. And there's a lot of, sometimes there's what can happen is a consultation fatigue. I have seen that happen a lot of time. It's a genuine thing. I don't think people really properly appreciate it. It's certainly in government, in every government that I've worked for, is just how many times you can keep going to the community to ask for things and not getting things back. And I think, like a lot of the time, then that might tell you that, there might be a way, your method of engagement might be needing something to be looked, or, might need to be revisited. For example, in Papua New Guinea, you could hold a roundtable discussion and get very little feedback. But then when you move to, say, using pictures as a form of engagement, that would really just turn on the taps and you get a lot of feedback coming in. So, but that might not be, that consultation mechanism might not work in some settings, and it might work. So I think probably the first instance, it might be, thinking hard about that fatigue, like how many times have you spoken to the same old people? The second thing, what's the method that you're using to engage, and giving some people a form of feedback that's not, I guess that can be quite discreet versus, doing, coming to council and speaking, for example, or filling out a form or writing something. Are they able to feedback in other types of ways? Or, yeah, like you mentioned, Shakir, as well, is that, are you ready to actually engage at this time? You know, where's the problem that you're actually trying to solve? Might it be worth doing it at a later time, you know, when you've given something more of a chance to play out? And I don't think there's any harm in erring on the side of caution and doing that sometimes when you don't have a pressing problem to actually solve, rather than create a policy for it and tangle yourself in it. It might be better to just revisit it down the track. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Dean, you had one more.
Yeah, I looked at some of the people whose pictures you brought up, and there was an interesting mix of people you might not have heard of and then people that you definitely heard of. Do you see later in life moving beyond that sort of, beyond your current role and stepping more into the public leadership role? Is that an aspiration, or are you happy where you're at? I realise that's a little bit of a loaded question in your job, but
no sweat, Dean. Thanks. No, thanks for the question. I think it's just really, you know, coming back to one thing I've sort of learned over time. You know, I didn't appreciate this at the start of my career, is just being able to do things that really satisfy you, and you know, that align with what you want to do. And you know, it can be great to think, you know, and have big aspirations, but you do, you know, whenever you do, you know, keep big things, you're still the same person, and you really have to be satisfied with what you do at the end. So what I really enjoy is just, you know, genuinely is like things like this, being involved in discussions like this. You'd be surprised how little, you all know this, of course, but how little these discussions actually take place outside of rooms like this. But then we need more of them. That capacity to value add, I think, is really important. And you can do that in any way. Everyone, you guys know how to do that. In whatever career you've chosen, or whatever you want to actually do. And I think that, yeah, it's just being able to be satisfied with whatever you want to do. And look, in my case, that might be something in public life, but I'd probably say it's more back in Australia than Dunedin. I'm just here to help for now, I think, and I don't have any political designs or anything like that for here, but yeah, I just think that, yeah, being able to be satisfied with what you're doing is just the key thing, and being able to contribute to a community like this is just really important too.
Well, thank you for contributing to ours today.
Yeah, thank you.
It's really cool. Just checking if anybody else has got something burning sitting there, but I'm just conscious that we're pretty much up to the amount of time that we'd asked you to go, and it's usually, and it's also in terms of our sustainability on Zoom,
Sure.
we're probably almost ready for a short little break before we debrief. But thank you so much. I mean, you've ranged over a really interesting range of things. It is such a joy for me to actually be here face to face with the guest speaker, and with Nicola here as well in the room, rather than being remote as I usually am these days.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks so much, Moji, and thanks, Nicola, and thank you everyone for the opportunity. Very much appreciate it. I presume there'll you'll be able, there's a chance to share my contact details with anyone. Yeah, brilliant. So Margie Jean will send those through, or just make them available. And please get in touch anytime. I'm more than happy to speak, you know, over the phone or just on email. So yeah, more than happy. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
That's fantastic, because part of what this is also doing is building our networks. So especially for the Dunedin people, knowing that you've actually got allies within council, that you can actually say, oh, I know you're trying to break down managerialism, but we've just come up against this little brick wall. What's your advice, Sean, about how we find our way through this dilemma? Who should we, even just without finding a brick wall, I think that sense of us being able to know that there are human beings in all of these institutions that we can actually build relationships with. And that whole approach of asking advice is actually a subtle way sometimes of our own advocacy as well. It's sort of saying, oh, excuse me, we've experienced this problem. What's your advice as to how we get through this? And it helps to alert you to how the system's working or not.
Absolutely.
So,
no, thanks so much.
Very inspiring also to just think about your pathway into this and all the setbacks that you've had to overcome.
Oh,
so
thank you.
So
thanks very much.
Thank you for a very, very, very interesting time.
Excellent.
Team, I'm going to suggest we come back about 25 past to just give ourselves, is that too long a break? No, let's just take a 10-minute break and we'll see you in 10 minutes to do, I'm sure, quite a rich debrief about what we've just been doing. So look forward to your thoughts and reflections then. start debriefing and bring the others in. I'm fascinated to actually know more about your housing project along the way too, because it's an area that I've worked in quite a bit as well, but we won't go there immediately. But yeah, let's just start off with digesting what's stood out. And speaking for Nicolau, who's not back now, but he was just, I'll feed in what he said in the room before Sean left as well along the way. But
Right.
how was that with Sean? What do you take? What are your takeaways?
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. I've got a page and a half of notes. It always takes me a while to let things filter down, but I really appreciated his sort of structured advice around, working with setbacks or challenges, because even though, I mean, we're already doing everything on his list, I'd love to find some jargon frameworks and slap that behavior into something, to be able to say, oh, well, we've adopted a best practice, and we're working on feedback loops and focusing on a different outcome,
Yeah.
So no, that was good.
And there probably are, I'm just trying to think about, there probably are some, I mean, he talked about deliberate practice. That was a phrase that I hadn't heard before. There's certainly stuff around intentional practice. I'm thinking there's other stuff about fail forward.
Yeah. I've never heard of that.
Fail forward is, that we've got this idea of feedback, which in its traditional sense was often sort of looking back. So fail forward is more about thinking about how we take the learning forward.
Is it a structure that you're, oh yeah.
Safe to fail experiments would be another phrase to Google.
Okay.
So we set things up on an experimental basis, knowing that we're taking a risk. So even the stuff we were doing yesterday about prototyping is a bit like that sense of making failure safe, because we're just calling it a prototype. We're just experimenting, and we're building some evaluative thinking, some evaluative processes around it to make it safe to fail. I quite often use that phrase of safe to fail experiments as a way of encouraging people to step out into something, knowing that they haven't got it. Don't wait till something's perfectly formed before you try it out.
Well, I mean, I'm an expert in that, but it's like that with power comes responsibility and the ability to affect other people, and that's positive and negative.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think being conscious about this is an experiment.
Yeah.
And this is our process around, because a lot of this this work is about doing things for the first time.
Yeah.
And the fact that, people who have their best practices already figured out and they know what they think they know kind of look at us sideways, kind of. So yes, any kind of structure to help build around experimentation and change is really helpful.
So actually, when you mention the phrase best practice, that's another trigger for me, actually, because best practices work in the simple zone. When things are simple, best practices are suited to a recipe, like baking a cake. And actually, when we're working in the complex zone, learning by doing and having intentional expectations. Yeah, so this is opening up another whole concept, actually. So if you go on to, I'll send out some links. Actually, might be easiest because I'm not very good at staying present to facilitate the conversation and putting links online.
Okay.
But if you, on Inspiring Communities website, which is the other organisation I work with, you can find some links to some videos that unpack complexity and what is actually different about working with things when they're simple compared to when they're complex.
Okay, thank you.
And when they're complex, we will never come up with an ongoing permanent idea about what best practice is.
Wonderful.
Because what works in your context and what works in Shakid's context and in Dean's and Juliana's and Dan's and Steffi's could be all quite different. Or Andrea's, who's just left, who's from our Zoom room today, then who's from Chile. You know, what works in one situation won't always work in another, because context matters so much when we've got things that are complex. So just be wary when we get
those. How do we find those resources?
Sorry?
How do I find those resources you just mentioned?
I can link you to quite a few off Inspiring Communities website, inspiringcommunities.org.nz. But if you can't find them through a search bit, I will, when I send the video out for this, which may not be till Friday because we're in the middle of a Otago Polytech staff meeting that started an hour ago, that I'll be in for the next couple of days. Yeah, but I'll send you some more links. I'll make a note to myself to send you some more links about the difference between simple, complicated, and complex. And also, yeah, but already on their website, if you look at the community-led development principles, the fifth one of the principles is learn by doing. And you'll see some resources there about how we build in the learning from the doing.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that took us quite a long way. That was to start this debrief conversation. Where do you want to take it next, and who else has got reflections about what you're taking away that might be completely different or similar? Go, Dean. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can hardly hear you.
Sorry. So there's a book that I've always really enjoyed called The E-Myth, and it's a model for how to run a business. And he divides the business operation into a technician, a manager, and an entrepreneur. And I've never been good at the management part. Seeing Sean so comfortable in that role was really quite inspiring. It's often the entrepreneur that gets all of the attention. But after hearing him talk and hearing Aaron talk earlier, it seems like it's the management types that really get everything done in council. So, I mean, there are obviously a lot of technicians, people on the ground that do the work, and they're more community led than other groups that I've seen. But yeah, DCC has a really good culture of understanding the value of solid management practice. That I think it's very easy to get focused on the leadership being out the front kind of stuff, and forget that most of the real work is in keeping everything moving smoothly and functioning. So there are the managers that vital link between the people doing the work and the people coming up with the ideas. And one thing that book reflects on is it's usually the manager that drives people nuts, because the technician thinks he can run the business and the entrepreneur wants to invent something new all the time. And I'm sure that that's an interesting problem that DCC would run into, with people wandering in off the streets with all kinds of ideas, and the guy filling the potholes thinking that, I work for a bunch of lunatics, because he doesn't see the big picture. So, and I thought he just did a really good job of representing how that's such a fulfilling role. I'd never actually found that attractive before, but seeing that, I was like, oh, I get it. Okay, I see why you'd want to do that, because, I mean, I definitely think one day we'll see him running somewhere for office. He's just got a lot of good ideas there.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's such tremendous value in seeing somebody who's in a present sense, operating in the present, rather than always projecting into the future. Which is one of my shortcomings. So I really I felt very grounded after seeing that. It was a really good experience. Thank you, Maggie Jean. So yeah,
it's interesting to reflect back for yourselves about those managerial skills, because at the best they're making it happen skills too, aren't they?
Yeah.
An entrepreneur needs a good manager and good technicians behind them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Juliana, we didn't give you any space in that to ask questions, but have you taken some things away?
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, policy is something that I don't know. I don't have much experience. I don't really know how things are done in a government level. And then the only thought that came to my mind was like, when creating policies in the consultation process, how effective consultations are, because sometimes the consultations the government do, and this is my perspective, sometimes might be hard to understand for a lot of people, or the wording, the language, and then how can you, from there, how can you reach out as many people as possible to get their feedback? So that was that's where I'm at, like thinking.
That's a really good transferable skill to anything we're doing too, isn't it? Because whether it's government reaching out and consulting people, or just us consulting people and wanting to engage other people in our projects, that's a capability we need in so many different contexts too, don't we? So everything we get grumpy about with government, about what we don't like about the way they consult, we can also turn that into, okay, so do I do the same sort of thing myself when I'm trying to consult people? How can I flip the failure of what I don't like about government into what I think is actually a more life-giving way to be consulted, and experiment with some of those things? Yeah. I was chuckling about that when I was going with my granddaughter to buy her birthday present a couple of weeks ago, because she was just about to turn 4, and I had gone on this expectation that she was going to choose what she actually wanted in the way of a new school bag from the shop, but actually her mother had ideas about what she thought was a good school bag as well. So I found myself facilitating decision making between mother and child to try and give the 4-year-old the illusion that she was actually making the decision, but actually teaching her that sometimes we have to make decisions. And that's a bit like government as well. You know, government says they're consulting, but actually they're ultimately deciding. And I regretted afterwards not saying to the 4-year-old, we want your input into this decision, but Nana's going to finally decide, or Mama's going to finally decide which bag we choose. So that was a little micro version of some of the dynamics that we sometimes get into around consultation as well. There's a pyramid, I think it's called Arnstein's ladder of consultation, that identifies about 7 different ways within which we might actually talk about consultation, right from the completely community-led and the community ultimately decides, to government really just sharing information about what they're going to do anyway. And in between that on the ladder, there's different layers of how much we really are consulting.
Can I ask Shaked a question on this topic?
Go.
Is that all right, Shaked?
Of course.
Yeah, please correct me if I'm wrong. I understand that you had a background in living in a kibbutz. Is that correct? What's the community decision process or the leadership style in that, and how is that different from what you're trying to do now, if it is different?
It really depends on the size of the kibbutz, and I think that's where what Maggie Jean was exactly saying at the moment, and I was also contemplating about. It really depends on the context in order, and there's kibbutz in different sizes, and so like there's kibbutz like that could be 50 adults and there's 5,000 adults.
Wow.
Generally they run with an elected committee and that just goes for it. And then on specific topics, depends on their constitution, they'll call a general meeting in which there's voting. The voting process, and so it depends on the level, and then there's consultation and so on. Yeah, the kibbutz is not a great, at least not. It used to be, the kibbutz used to be much more on every small thing they'd call in such general meeting. And over the years, I think they've delegated more and more to the operating committees.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And are you going to, do you have a specific model in mind for what you're doing as far as that, you know, community-led versus, you know, somebody's an expert, we should listen to them?
I think that I've had quite a bit of experience over the past 7-8 years at Kotara Village and developing that. And yeah, I was reflecting a lot when Sean was speaking about exactly those kind of points that Maggie Jean was also referring to now. And in some ways, when you were sharing that example, MJ, about your granddaughter, it's kind of a sad example. I was thinking that that's maybe the reality often. But maybe again, there's room for all the different, and at the village, at the start, I think that I had quite a bit more experience than other people, than some of the others. And I was kind of spearing ahead with identifying issues and identifying doors and walls that we can unlock through developing systems. And so I was kind of spearing ahead in developing systems and writing policy and how we can do this and how we can do that and how we can do that. And at some point, and I was always kind of putting it out to receive feedback until someone smartly enough told me, this just, it looks good. It just feels complete. And it's kind of, I don't know, you know, she didn't know how to engage with that. You know, it seemed complete. She haven't studied the area too deeply, and it seems fine. And a coin dropped at that point. Like, this is useless, that way of consulting. It's like, it's just not, I don't, you know, and another person told me at that period of time, look, like, we've elected you to do that because we trust what you are, you know, we trust your skill there. And I was like, no, this is not okay. I don't trust myself. I don't know anything about this. Like, this is about us. And so it took a while, you know, to think about it and how to deal with that. And yes, definitely, like, consulting early and bringing ideas and sharing the ideas in an open forum and really starting with brainstorming and only then going to start writing stuff. But the systemic change was when we incorporated sociocracy. And so this just flipped the whole thing. Instead of, like, there's a few people on the trust board trying to figure it out and they are asking for the wisdom of the rest. It became, well, this is all of us. And each of us is responsible for a set of things, and we work together, and everyone became involved, and everyone became responsible, and everyone became active. And then we didn't need consultation so much. People were right there doing the work and developing the policy together, which was such a better process. And of course, it's not applicable everywhere, but the more it is, I believe, the better.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's not the first time the concept of sociocracies crossed my notebook. Are you saying that there's principles within that system that you applied or your group applied that in themselves were enough to generate engagement? Yeah?
Heaps.
Wow.
I'd really encourage you, specifically in the work that you're doing, I'd really encourage you to learn about sociocracy. I can send you an amazing book.
Yes, please. I'll put my address in the chat thing.
I've got it. I've got a PDF kind of thing on. Yeah, so if I have
Okay.
your email, I can send you and yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Shaked.
It's called Many Voices, One Song.
Okay.
And it's a really beautiful book about how to run a sociocratic kind of organization. And even if you don't run a sociocratic organization, it's got an enormous amount of wisdom about how to work together.
Shaked, do you want to send me the link send me the PDF and I attach it to the recording that goes out to everybody?
I feel a little bit uncomfortable to share the PDF widely because we kind of bought the book as an organization.
Right.
It's fine kind of to give it to someone, but it's really not fair for the writers if I really share it widely.
Okay.
I can share the link for people's ability to purchase the book.
That would be really useful. And so so Steffi and Briar have both indicated in the chat room that they're really interested. And if you could share the name of the book and is it Sociography?
Sociocracy.
Okay. So
And
if
the
you
book
could,
is called Many Voices, One Song.
right. That sounds like a really useful resource sharing that's coming out of this conversation.
Another book for the library.
Yeah. So as Nicolaus just said, another book for the library, because there's no reason why the library can't buy a book and then it's available for everyone.
Yeah.
So I've got Winners Don't Cheat on the list, and I will add Many Voices, One Song to the list of, and then anybody, even at a distance, do you all know that you can actually order books from the library and they'll be posted out to you? Yeah. So and we haven't got our book budget fully spent. So when you think about often the sense of, oh, budget's the issue, it's not actually usually for the library books. So see if you can help us spend the library book budget by asking for what you want. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you, Shakir. That seems really useful sharing. Other people. Oh, we've just lost Dan. I was just about to ask him to check in. Steffi, you're allowed to stay hiding if you want to stay hidden, but just, oh, and Nicola, we haven't heard from you. Do you want to go next? In terms of, what you've taken out of things.
I was about to just quickly go next before I duck away to move my car and not get a ticket. But I was saying to Sean when he was here in person that I really took out the circle of influence and the way that that kind of just clicked in terms of how we use technology at the moment. We have such a wide ability to influence a lot of people through just the vast scope of technology and how it is used, especially with social media. But that doesn't mean that we have to. And usually if we try or in the way that I've been looking at social media, when we try and expand a little bit too far with the circle of influence, we lose parts of it, and you may have a lot of backing and kind of a lot of noise around it, but it doesn't actually, when the work needs to be done or when you need to be on the ground, it doesn't actually turn up. The people aren't really there in the metaphorical kind of speaking. And so I'm just like thinking around, I just got cogs turning in my brain in terms of that circle of influence and how to use that at the right in the right ways and at the right time, especially around the freedom that we do have in influencing a lot of people's decisions or questions when we can share it so freely to someone that we've never met on the other side of the world. Yeah, so just kind of that idea started to start pondering, and how does that actually look when we start going deeper into that question.
It's almost like the parallel of your product, of your video, like
Exactly.
we're talking about with the policy. How do you engage people in the policy? But it's almost like how are you going to engage people in the product without all that attention to relationship building. Well, yeah, good luck with not getting the parking ticket, and thanks so much for joining us. It's lovely to see you in person and to hear where your projects develops for you. So hopefully see you more times. We can't promise to get this room often, and given it's lovely to have this room today, but I'm just sorry that more couldn't join us here. That's just how it is. Yeah. Cool.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, Nicola. So any other conversation threads that people want to pick up in the last few minutes here? Because I think everybody who's wanted to have a say has done so. So and Brian's just saying you need to duck away to collect something. Just before you duck away, to let you know that next week we've got a woman, Wendy Preston, again on a sort of a theme about the arts and activism. But also we could end up having our program monitor come in, because it's next Wednesday, we're being monitored by the external monitor. They might actually turn up in the space as well. So don't be put off by about asking questions. Please just be yourselves as much as possible, if not more so, to give the monitor an example of how alive this space is. So
okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And did I miss the Tauiwi group this morning?
Sorry?
Did I miss the Tauiwi group this morning? Was there a Tauiwi?
I didn't show up, so I don't know.
I saw when I went online that to start to get organised before I could get into this room, there was something happening, but I didn't actually click the button. So Steffi's just asking, do you want Stacey's email?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Okay, anyway, I'll figure that out. I'll let you finish the conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you so
okay.
much again, everyone. That was just a brilliant afternoon.
Cool. Thanks, Brian. It's lovely having you in this learning space. So anybody else got threads that they want to pick up on, or are we just about there for today? Feels like a really rich conversation that we've been having, and I guess what my big takeaway is that whole tension between that we hold and work with the whole time in leadership between the product and the process. You know, it's the tension between the what and the how. You know, we've got a thing that we're actually working on, of something that we're wanting to create. But the process of how we actually get there, how we engage people, is absolutely fundamental to who will actually have on board the waka with us. And it links a bit with what we were doing yesterday in the design thinking space as well. You know, we can design something that's really beautiful, but if actually it hasn't got any connection with the users and the people that are actually and the needs that are out there, the users' needs, then it's actually going nowhere. So that's something that I'm just reflecting on, that feels like an underlying sort of thread of what we're talking about. And it's not to say that we can have only process and not product, or only product and not process. You know, we're actually holding both of those. So any final reflections from any of you before we wrap up? Okay, we started with a bit of silence and we'll end with a little bit of silence. But also just to say, because the monitor's coming next week, I've just had a lateral thought yesterday with the intensive. We got people like Dean and Briar who were there online and in person, giving a bit of feedback about the program. I'm going to put a link on Moodle and think about other ways of getting it out to encourage anybody else who's got feedback about the program to send that in, because we're just doing a bit of rapid gathering of quotes from students. Unfortunately, we should have been working on this long before the monitor's visit, but we're just so under-resourced with Ray, our dear colleague, 0.5 not actually having been replaced yet, that we're doing one of those seat of the pants last minute, gathering up a fantastic report for the monitor to celebrate both what we are doing as well as to acknowledge what challenges we know we've got ahead, and we want your voice in that as well. So if you can find a little bit of time to give us a little bit of feedback, that will be great. So watch this space. Somewhere in the next day or two, I'll send out a link for some very quick responses from people. So thank you for showing up. I just really appreciate the aliveness of this space and all your contributions to make it so. So go well, go gently, keep on changing the world one day at a time, as I often say. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.